Our next speaker, Charles Green, is a superb thinker, speaker, and advisor on building trust, confidence, and superior relationships with customers. Charlie is the author of 2 books on trust-based customer relationship. The first book is how I came to know him, called The Trusted Advisor. It sits on my desk. It's a terrific management resource on executing and maintaining strong relationships. Charlie's recently released second book is on trust-based selling. He has worked with a lot of the world's largest financial institutions and technology companies. He's taught executive ed at the business schools of Kellogg, Northwestern, and Columbia. He is the founder of Trusted Advisors Associates. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Charlie Green. Thanks for being here.
There I was, a newly promoted manager in a consulting firm up in Boston. Now, the way that you got ahead in that firm, the way you rang the bell, was you brought in a new client, a new piece of business. For that, you became a hero. And by the way, when I say ring the bell, I mean that literally, because our boss in the office at that time was ex-Navy, into things nautical, and he had a 100-pound ship's bell mounted outside the office. And on those occasions when somebody did succeed in pulling off this tremendous feat of bringing in a new piece of business, we made a big deal out of it. We celebrated Friday afternoon wine and cheese party and a champagne toast in honor of the person who had accomplished this deed. Well, I was at that stage in my career where I wanted this honor. I could taste it. For whom the bell tolls, my turn. And one day we got a lead that came in from a company down the road, Boston, in Worcester, Massachusetts, an old line manufacturing company called the Norton Company. They make abrasives. That means grinding wheels and sandpaper. Some of you may still have Behr brand sandpaper sitting out in your garage somewhere. Well, the meeting was at 8 a.m. It was with the VP of Marketing. We were a general management consulting firm, so this was a good lead for us. 8 a.m. meeting. I set my alarm, of course, for about 5:30. Wake up at 5. Try on all 3 of my ties for half an hour. Got to get the right tie. And I make my way to Worcester. Well, I get to Worcester by 7 o'clock. Worcester isn't open at 7 o'clock. You drive around, go to McDonald's, drain them of their coffee, and eventually at about 7:45, I make my way to the parking lot of, they call it Norton's up in Worcester, where I met with my boss, who was joining me on this triumphal meeting. At about 60 seconds of 8, we knock on the door, appropriately eager, but not too much so. Meet the VP Marketing, pour more coffee, shake hands, change the business cards, and then it happens. It's the moment that always happens. I don't know why I didn't see it coming this time. He says to me, "So, Mr. Green, tell me, what experience have you had doing marketing studies for industrial consumables?" And I thought, what the? And then I thought, wait a minute, he's invented a fancy word for sandpaper. No problem. But then I thought instantly, oh my God, how many marketing studies have we done in sandpaper? Let me tell you, that's a pretty narrow vertical market. And I had this funny feeling that probably the answer was never. Now, I'm guessing that there aren't too many of you here that have had the chance to sell general management consulting services to sandpaper companies. Correct me if I'm wrong. Raise your hand, identify yourself. But can you relate, nonetheless, to how I felt in that moment, the feeling in the pit of the stomach? Help me out here. This means yes, that means no. Hard for me to see with the lights, but you get it, what it's like? What do you do in a moment like that? Well, I'd fortunately had some good training. I went to what they euphemistically call a well-known Eastern business school. The company I worked for had done very good training in this area. And the brain, which is operating under heavy adrenaline in a moment like this, rapidly begins to formulate an answer, and it was going to sound about like this. Not exactly, but we've done a lot of things very similar to that. We've looked at market segmentation studies and sales force management studies and distribution channel studies, and we've looked at businesses as diverse as shipbuilding, chip manufacturing, automobile fabrication, and frankly, if you take all these different elements of expertise that we have to apply to the situation, we'll get a far better answer than somebody who is merely narrowly siloed into sandpaper. What do you think? It's not that bad, really, for at least in the consulting business, for a newly minted MBA. And I'm about ready to deliver myself of this pearl of wisdom, and suddenly my boss leans into the picture. Remember, my boss is there. The question was, what experience do you have doing marketing studies for industrial consumables? He leaned in and he said, shoot, none that I can think of. What else would you like to talk about? Well, I almost fell over. You're not supposed to say that. And yet instantly the client reacted in a very interesting way. He leaned back, relaxed, he said, shoot, that's okay, hardly anybody's done sandpaper marketing, really. What else have you done that would be useful to talk about? And then you see I can proceed to tell him exactly what I was going to say, word for word, all that experience business, but with 180 degrees of difference. Because let's face it, the subtext of what I said to him, the meaning within the words, the real meaning, if you were to translate it to people talk, would sound something kind of like this. Well, Mr. Client, that was a pretty stupid question you just asked me. I'll get rid of it with 3 words, not exactly, but then I'll tell you the question you should have asked me, and by the way, then I'll answer it, and when I'm finished answering, you'll know who the smart person in the room was, and by the way, that would be me. Isn't that really what I was about to tell him? And by contrast, my boss's answer was very different. If you translate my boss's answer into human talk, it sounded something like, Mr. Client, we just met. Coffee's not even cold. But I want you to know from the very beginning of our interactions together what you can expect. What you can expect here is straight, no spin control. You ask a direct question, you will get a direct answer. I will have opinions and points of view, and I will not hesitate to express them to you. But I'm not going to waste your time or mine moving down paths that are not relevant and interesting to you. It ended up being a successful sales call. We did get the deal. I did ring the bell, perhaps more credit due me than should have been. But I took the opportunity, and it ended up being a very successful assignment. And for years after that, it occurred to me from time to time to think about this humble little example as a way in which trust develops in relationships. For example, one small component of it, the very thing that you're most afraid of saying, I don't know, is exactly the thing that created trust in this moment. There's a paradoxical quality to trust relationships. There's some other aspects of it as well. I just want to point that one out. I often thought of that example as years went by. And then roughly 10 years after the fact, it dawned on me one day, every time I thought of this little example, I thought about the feelings in the pit of my stomach. And the brain is rattling around in my skull and voices screaming in my head, get me out of here, get me out of here. 10 years later, it dawned on me, gee, I wonder what the client was thinking that day. It took me 10 years to ask myself that question. And I now imagine that the client got up that morning, set his alarm for 5 o'clock, and woke up a little bit early, and thought, gee, today I have to go commit $250,000, used to be a big number, trust me, of the company's money to a bunch of shake your hands, count your fingers, pointy-headed intellectuals down the river at Harvard. I better be careful. I better watch out. I don't want to get taken to the cleaners, bamboozled, etc. What will I do? I know. I'll make sure we focus the effort on my industry, my expertise, my acronyms, my technical knowledge, and so forth. That way, I will be in control of this meeting. So if you think about what was happening in that interesting little meeting, there were 2 things going on. Number one, there was a social action that happens that we call sales, a highly constructed social dialogue between 2 people executed along very familiar social lines, very politely, very well done. And beneath that, beneath the surface, was another dialogue that's basically a naked, raw struggle for control and power, one over the other. Who will bend the other person to their will? Who will get their will done at the expense of the other? And let me suggest to you that those 2-level dialogues, to some extent, tend to show themselves up in every sales conversation you have, every negotiation you have with a JV partner, every incidence of persuasion that you try to get somebody in a sister division or even your coworkers to do. Don't we often have traces of those 2 levels of interaction? What I'd like to talk to you about today is to suggest it doesn't have to be that way. These are reconcilable. And furthermore, it had better not be that way. Because dealing with the customers of the future, this combative, competitive relationship will not serve you well. Trust-based relationships, I listened to Steve Weiss talk about the complexity of scalability in your business. That's going to mean massively more transactions. Transactions will kill you. You will choke on them unless you can figure out a way to do them efficiently. And the best way to do them efficiently is to develop trusting relationships with all the people you're transacting with. So let's talk a little bit today about the dynamics of trust, how it works, and let's also try and have a little fun along the way. I have 2 basic simple messages just to give you a headline. Number one, trust works a little bit paradoxically. There are very few businesses today that actually get it, either with their customers or with each other. Second message, trust increasingly in the future will be the new glue that ties things together. Those who get it will be very successful. Now, let's try and have a little fun along the way here. let me give you some context by talking about the customer's viewpoint. And let's use a movie metaphor here. All right, name the movie quickly. What do I hear? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's exactly right. Interesting movie, Lee Van Cleef, Eli Wallach, and of course Clint Eastwood. American-produced, American actors movie filmed in Spain with an Italian director. Truly a multicultural enterprise. Terrific movie, too. How many of you have actually seen the movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Quite a few of you. Great. Well, it's an interesting metaphor if we think about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Trust, sales, and relationships. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Trust, sales, and relationships. I'll let you match them up particularly in a fairly obvious way. If you remember, the movie began with the ugly, the character of the ugly, which in this juxtaposition is relationships. That role was ably played by Eli Wallach, if you remember. Now, why would I be talking about relationships as ugly? Let me give you a few examples. CRM software, which you all know something about. Customer relationship management, the management of relationships with customers. That's a high potential kind of a software product that allows you to collect information about your particular customers, deploy that information in a useful way. If there was any category of product that ought to be customer focused, client sensitive, all these good things, it ought to be something called CRM. And yet, and I'm not casting aspersions at all at your implementation, but there are vendors out there who, if you go out on the web, you'll see CRM sold in something like the following way. Buy our CRM product, use it to run customer profitability analyses, figure out who the low profit and high profit customers are, fire deep six, get rid of the low profit customers, and suck more money out of the high profit ones. How customer friendly does that sound? That's what I mean by ugly. The words, the language of emotions, things like relationships, increasingly in the broader business world out there are getting used in a cynical kind of a way that makes customers into objects. What's another example? The term customer focus. Watch how the term customer focus actually gets used out there in the general business world. And you'll see very frequently customer focus is the customer focus of a vulture. Vultures are customer focused, very much so. But they're kind of in it for themselves, right? It matters why you are being customer focused. An awful lot of what passes for sales training out there, for example, or salesmen, again, not in your organization. In fact, let me just stop for a second. I was in Seattle 2 days ago, and my client there, who is the former head of strategic planning for the American Institute of Architects, paid you all a terrific compliment. I mentioned I was going to be speaking here, and he said, oh, wow, I had the most wonderful sales experience with one of their associates talking about a timeshare. It was phenomenal. They treated me with respect. It was great. It was just really worth mentioning. So I want to make sure to mention that. I have seen and heard a little bit firsthand, much more so secondhand. Much of what I have to say about selling, I want to be clear, it's what's done in the rest of the world, not necessarily what's done with you. In the rest of the world, however, this notion of customer focus is often focused on as a way of, in order to get something else, to win the deal, to close the sale, essentially to gain profitability and market share for our own good. Well, you know what? The more complicated and complex the product that you're selling, the more customers know in their bones who you're in it for. And if you're in it for you and not for them, that translates into lack of trust, and they can smell it. More ugliness, customer loyalty, another term. Here's a little website from thewisemarketer.com, a UK website, why bargain hunters are good for loyalty schemes. 32% of loyalty program members in the US are Sherlocks, people who crave the best deals and will work hard to find them. They'll search 7 different stores for the best deal on a new suit and check the websites of loyalty programs before buying. The word loyalty 100,000 years ago, or maybe not so long, used to mean till death do us part. Semper Fi. Greater love hath no man than this. And now it's price shopping. When did that happen? Yet another word, yet another emotional relationship concept being flipped around, bastardized, if you will, translated into its exact opposite in service of some seller-focused goal rather than true customer orientation. Interesting, one of the world's large, primary, excellent IT consulting firms, Capgemini, here's one of their web pages. The Capgemini Loyalty Factory. The implication, if you think about it differently, is we can manufacture loyalty for you in our IT factory. Perfectly acceptable website for a major company to make. But look at it differently. What has happened to the word loyalty in this context? Again, a terribly relationship-driven word used in a not so clean way. That's what I'm talking about when I say relationships as ugly. Well, the second character in the movie, if you recall, was the one played by Lee Van Cleef, the bad, which in our sequence here would be sales. Now again, I'm not talking about you. I wrote a book on sales. Believe me, I'm with you on this. But you know how the outside culture in the world tends to look at the notion of salespeople and how cynical they are and how guarded and how careful. So let's talk about the bad for just a moment. It's interesting to think why the culture thinks that way. Well, let's take a look at the dictionary definition of the word sell. And with your permission, I'm actually going to read it out loud for dramatic effect here. Sell, to give up or make over to another for a consideration, dispose of to or purchase for a price, to deal in, keep, or offer for sale, to make a sale or offer for sale to persuade or induce someone to buy something, to persuade or induce someone to buy something, to cause to be accepted, to cause or persuade to accept, convince, now we're going to get good, to accept a price for or make a profit of something not a proper object for such action, to force or exact a price for, informal, to cheat, betray, or hoax, to make a sale of something, to be on sale, to offer something for sale, to be employed to persuade or induce others to buy as a salesman or a clerk in a store. Slang, cheat, hoax, see also sell up, sell down the river, sell out, hard sell, soft sell. What's the flavor of this word? Kind of negative. You know, the worst part of it in there is one of the last ones, sell down the river. In pre-Civil War United States, it was legal for someone to capture a slave from the South who had escaped and become a legitimate citizen. It was legal to capture them and resell them back into slavery down the river. I can't think of an uglier connotation to be associated with a word. And lucky you get to be in a job where you get to sell. And what that means, of course, as you know, is you're up against these subliminal, subconscious thoughts that many people have walking in. Tough picture I'm painting here, right? We're saying not only are relationships used in the general business word in kind of an ugly way, but people have a negative attitude towards sales. Geez, Charlie, is that all we have to look forward to? Isn't there anything positive you can tell us? Yes, there is. I do have some encouraging words. We have one more character in the movie, if you recall, the good guy, Clint Eastwood, which, of course, in this trilogy is all about trust. Let me give you some examples of the way we actually use the word trust in the real world so we can understand what's meant by that. Dictionary definitions aren't that helpful, and trust is a word that's awfully vague. So let's see how people actually use it. Here's a print ad from a few years ago from the Discovery Channel introducing themselves, or Discovery.com, excuse me, when they first came on the web, saying, you know us from TV, the Discovery Channel. Now we're on the internet. You trusted us there. You can trust us here. When they use the word trust, what is a synonym for what they're talking about? It's probably something like safety in this particular visual image. You know, jump out here, Daddy will catch you. It's safe. So there's one possible synonym when we use the word trust. Wall Street Journal article, Dellnet, Dell Computer Company, used to operate an internet service operation, ISP. They sold it to Microsoft Network. There were some service degradation problems, bad enough that Microsoft got written up in the Wall Street Journal. MSN has done a great job marketing this service, but a terrible job delivering it, says Shannon Hughes. We couldn't trust it anymore, says Peter Krause, her husband. And what does Peter Krause mean when he says trust here? What's a synonym? Reliability, right, or dependability. Couldn't trust it. So there's another synonym for trust. Here's a great one, funeralnet.com. You can't make these up. It says right here, welcome to FuneralNet, America's most trusted online obituary, funeral, cremation, etc. service. The most trusted, it says so right here. You can blast your loved one's ashes off up into space. If you don't have time to write an obituary for your mother, you can find one here. And what in the world are they talking about here? You know, you would think, anybody in the funeral business, if you think about the HBO show 6 Feet Under, for example, what you would want to convey would be empathy, sincerity, respect. Does this ad show any of those things? I think probably not. Just by saying we're trustworthy, trust me, we're sensitive, does not deliver the message. It's an interesting example of a disconnect. Here's a great one. Highly trusted and recommended casinos. Now you may think, well, that's an oxymoron. Think again. If you were to trust your hard-earned money to a fly-by-night outfit in the Caribbean through your MasterCard, what would you want to be really sure about? How about that if you win, they pay off? You know, you don't mind getting bled dry slowly. That's the name of the game. That's gambling. The house wins. Okay, that's the price of entertainment. But you don't want to get kneecapped when you might win. So interestingly enough, the notion of integrity may actually be more important in that business than it is in yours. In any case, it's another synonym for trust. A couple more quick examples. All a bunch of fine print from PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big four accounting firms, talking here about e-business. It's a matter of trust. They're talking about data confidentiality, privacy, data security, and so forth. Another use of the word trust. And then finally, this classic visual image, probably speaking to selflessness. We're there for you. This is an ad for ewasaw.com, insurance online, small business insurance from someone you can trust. All these different examples of trust, it's kind of a complex word. Now, when I majored in philosophy in college, God knows why, but I did. And then I went to work in a strategy consulting firm where we had to do lots of analytical work. And I bow to nobody in my respect for the power of analytical rigor. And yet, when I came to start looking at trust-based relationships and how trust works, I could not escape the idea that it's the soft stuff. It doesn't exactly lend itself to quantification or hard analysis. And I thought, gee, how will I hold my head up with respect to all my friends who are all this other type of person? So I give you the trust equation. It actually works pretty well as an equation. I'll define it in a moment, but basically, trust is a function of four factors I'd suggest to you. Credibility, reliability, and intimacy, all arrayed in the numerator of an equation, and in the denominator, a factor called self-orientation. Now, if you just look at the equation by itself, credibility, intimacy, and reliability, if you increase the values of those, what happens to the value of trust? It goes up, right? On the other hand, what happens if you increase the value of the factor in the denominator? What happens to the value of trust? It goes down, right? So credibility, reliability, intimacy, if you have those, you become perceived as more trustworthy. If you are, however, perceived as being high in self-orientation, your trustability level will go down. Now let me define them for you quickly. When we use trust as a synonym for credibility, we're mostly talking about words. So we might say in a sentence, for example, I can trust what he says about this subject. He's believable, he's credible. I can quote him, I can take that to the bank. You can trust him. When we use trust as a synonym for reliability, here we're talking more about actions. And in a sentence, we might say, I can trust him to do this. If he said he'll bring the projector, I don't need to bring a backup. I can trust him, he's reliable, he's dependable. When we use trust and we're meaning intimacy, here we're talking about a sense of security. And when you hear that in a sentence, somebody meaning intimacy, it's something like, I can trust him with this information. I can tell him this, and he'll know whether to tell somebody else or not. He'll know whether to laugh or not. He has empathy, discretion. I feel secure with him. That's the intimacy connotation. Now again, increasing all three of those increases trust. The fourth factor is interesting. If your orientation is about yourself, the focus is on yourself, that becomes perceived as a high level of self-orientation, and that's bad. When we're talking about trust in this sense, we use an interesting word, caring. I can trust that he cares about. And if fill in the blank is cares about himself, then we don't trust him very much. But if we trust that he cares about me, that's all the difference in the world. And if you notice, there's one factor in the denominator and three in the numerator. Guess which one is the most powerful? It's the one in the denominator. Simple example, if I go back to my sandpaper story, in that moment, when my boss responded very quickly, I don't know, the client learned two things. Number one, this guy doesn't know much about sandpaper. Number two, I think I just met an honest man. In that moment, with respect to self-orientation, before I answered the question, what was my level of self-orientation on a scale of 1 to 10 when the client said to me, how much experience do you have doing marketing studies for industrial consumables? Where was my level of self-orientation? It was an 11, and you can relate to it, right? By contrast, when my boss answered, his level of self-orientation was so low that he could hear a question. What experience do you have? None that I can think of. What a concept, to simply be able to hear a question without adding all the ego and all the attachments that we put onto it dependent on the outcome, simply to hear and respond. That's a small example of a very low level of self-orientation, and you can see how powerful it is. That's clearly what happened to my friend in Seattle from the Architectural Association the other day. Somebody spoke to him, not out of their needs, but out of his. What are some things that happen when customers trust you, or for that matter, when anyone trusts you? Well, here's some generic categories for all businesses when your customers trust you. You get less challenges. They don't push back on you as much. They don't second guess. They don't double check you. If you're in an institutional sales business, they don't do as much multiple sourcing, or you don't get requests for proposals. Things are done much more comfortably, face-to-face, handshake, smile, and so forth. You get hit much less with management by process. We have to go through the rules here. And an awful lot more of let's just make this thing happen. Finally, elapsed time gets incredibly compressed when you're dealing with people who trust you. You also get more of certain other things. You get more willingness to listen to you and to take your ideas and to take your advice, more cooperation, more fast tracking in certain kinds of businesses, more sharing of information, more forgiveness. You screw up occasionally. You know what? They'll cut you a break. And finally, you get an awful lot more efficiency and effectiveness. These are things that happen when trust increases. Basically, that first group lowers your costs. It's a way of cutting transaction costs. The second group of results applies to higher revenues and margins. One message I'd like to give you is this is not airy-fairy, softy, mufty, fluffy stuff. Trust means money, among other things. I don't mean to deny the soft part of it, but it also means hard dollars economics. It works. Let's take a look at some of the conventional models. I'm going to go to the world of selling just as an example, but we're really talking about influence here. How do you persuade another human being of your point of view? How does that work? Let's use sales as an example. Many of you I know have been to, or you're familiar with, or you've seen outside sales training programs. It seems to me all of them have three characteristics in common. Number one, they all have arrows, don't they? There's always a left or right arrow. They may, the particular arrows may differ, but there's always got to be an arrow in sales training, it seems. Secondly, most of them start with a notion of buying and derive a notion of selling, which I think makes a lot of sense. If you want to sell, first figure out how they buy. But the third characteristic is one I want to focus on. The highly respected, big, complex, expensive sales training programs, mostly, for the most part, that are out there, have a third characteristic, and that is they define buyers' behavior as rational decision-making. In fact, I'll quote directly from one of the leading sales training programs. They're talking about corporate institutional buyers here more than they are retail, but they're still human beings. And they say, quote, the decision-making process is a subcategory of rational decision-making. Well, I don't know about you, but I remember having an epiphany one day thinking, you know what? That's so far from true. Let me give you one small example and see if it resonates. There's a gentleman named Dwight Davies who heads the Deloitte Consulting's telecommunications practice. They sell systems consulting to the big telecoms of the world. Well, back in 2001 or so, telecoms were in the dumps, and consulting to telecoms was even lower. And one day, Dwight gets a phone call from one of the world's big telecom firms saying, Dwight, we want you to submit an RFP, $5 million worth of business. And Dwight said, we hate RFPs. They take forever. They're nothing but price. They drive you through hoops. But $5 million feeds a lot of consultants. We had to do it. So we went through the process, didn't know they made binders that big, months go by. Finally, Dwight gets a phone call from the client, and the client says, Dwight, congratulations, you've won the technical competition. And Dwight, who's no dummy, said, well, if you're telling me we won the technical competition, we probably lost the deal, right? And the client said, yeah, Dwight, you did. That's right, you lost the deal. And Dwight said, why? I mean, I really thought we had this one. We really were the best. We did everything you asked. We did a whole lot more. We gave you advice on how to do this whole process. I really don't comprehend why we lost this. And the client said, Dwight, you people don't use our telephones. That's it? $5 million worth of consulting, you don't use our phones? Maybe you could have told me that in the beginning. What kind of sense does that make? That's rational decision-making in the corporate world. And it doesn't look very rational. In a much simpler way, Jeffrey Gitomer, the author of a couple of best-selling sales books, the Little Red Book of Selling, says people buy with their hearts and justify it with their brains. I think that says it very elegantly. The business world outside of Marriott tends to think of selling and decision-making as a rational process, and many of you know very well that's not the whole truth. People are not crazy, they're not insane, they're not irrational, they're not psychotic. But to describe us as purely rational decision makers, whether it's selling or influencing, is to miss the essence of what it is to be people and the essence of what it is to create trust. It really looks a little bit more like this. In some businesses, it has two steps. There's first a decision to engage. Maybe it's a review of possible vendors. And there's a very distinct second step called making the decision. I was giving this talk to an offsite for a law firm outside of Denver a few years ago, and sitting over about there in the front row was a woman client of this law firm. And she raised her hand and said, "Mr. Green, do you mind if I make a comment? I'll tell a little story about this." I'm trying to look client sensitive, so sure, come on up. She came up and she said, "I'm the chief counsel for a Fortune 50 company. We recently had to hire a law firm. It was a very important decision for us, an important piece of work that had to be done. And we looked at 12 different law firms and examined and analyzed all their capabilities, and narrowed it down to 3, and invited the 3 in to give us a presentation of 90 minutes each." Well, she said the first firm came in, and they did 90 minutes, and they were terrific, really better than we expected. They'd done their homework, they understood our business, they'd done all kinds of analyses, they even had free advice for us. And they left, and we thought, well, our only problem now is how to stay awake for the rest of the day. Then the second firm came in, and she said, my gosh, if anything, they were even a little better. More experience, more credentials, more free advice. They left, and we thought, now we got a real problem. How do we choose between A and B? And she said, then the third firm came in, and they did something different. They said, we have 90 minutes with you, right? We can do the march of 1,000 slides. We're happy to do that. But what we'd like to suggest is something different. What we'd like to suggest is that we take the first 85 minutes with you and actually begin the job right here, right now. Start the work as if we had already won the contract and start working. And when 85 minutes are up, we'll stop and say, how's it feel like to work with us? Because, you know, there's no better way to know what it's like to work with us than to actually work with us. And she said, you know, I thought they had me right there, but I wasn't about to say so. I said, okay, we'll try your 85-minute thing. And we started working, and she said an interesting thing happened immediately. You could immediately assess the trust that we had in these people because they had to answer in real time about our issues. It wasn't canned talks about how great we are, what our features were, what our capabilities were. It was real time. Help me on my problem. We began to be able to trust them immediately. And as we began to trust them, we began to open up as well. And we began to acknowledge parts of what was going on with us. We'd say, well, we haven't really finished that study yet, and maybe we have a little bit more work over here. We got an awful lot of work done. 85 minutes went by in no time. And when it finished, we didn't even ask them to leave the room. We just looked at each other, nodded, and said, these people have the job. Now, what that law firm had figured out to do is what I call selling by doing, not selling by telling. I know that you have figured this out in many ways in your sales organization already. People are far more likely to be persuaded, convinced, if you relate things to them instead of cycling through all the rational reasons why they should do what you want. It's kind of like sample selling. If you go into an ice cream store and they have a new flavor, they have lemon licorice, and you say, gee, lemon licorice, what's that like? They don't say, well, it has a front end kind of a patina of lemon with a back kick taste of licorice. No, they give you the wooden spoon and you try it. Sample selling. This firm had figured out how to sample sell something abstract. Very powerful and effective. I think of it very simply this way. If you were to go out with somebody on a blind date for the first time, would you want to hear them talk about the last 17 people they went out with? Not an effective dating strategy. Probably not effective. And yet, in business, what is taught out there in the broader business world, and I'm not necessarily talking about you here, this is exactly what business is taught to do. Figure out what the customer's need is, start telling them why what you have will satisfy their need. Talk, 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 we've done this much with these other customers and so forth. What's everybody's favorite subject? It's ourselves. The most effective way, it turns out, to persuade anybody of anything is to talk about the meaning of it to them. In particular, let them talk to you and you listen. Conventional business wisdom, also at its heart, is based on the notion of competition. Andy Grove, former chairman of Intel, wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive, which inspires this little photograph, I think. And if you think about the way business is talked about, I'm talking now about the Harvard Business Review and Fortune magazine and the Wall Street Journal and seminars that are put on all over the world, they're very much about competition and paranoia. What is the most commonly used metaphor in business to describe business itself? When we talk about business using a metaphor, what's the most common metaphor, do you think? War, I would say, is maybe number 2. How about sports? I don't know which is number 1, number 2. I haven't done a survey on it, but they're both up there. Just look at these little phrases that we use, borrowed from the athletic world, from sports. Many of us have probably used half of these words just in the last week. Now, here's the point. In that metaphor, the sports metaphor, the competition metaphor, Yankees, Red Sox, Lakers, Celtics, whatever, where is the customer? Answer, nowhere. That metaphor isn't about customers. It's about competitors. Isn't that interesting? The very language that we use most commonly to describe business doesn't talk about customers. How about the other one, the war metaphor? There are courses taught out there in business about what we can learn from the great military theorists of all time. They're very popular courses put on by very respectable, reputable institutions. Where is the customer in that metaphor? In the sports metaphor, you could argue there are at least fans in the stands. There are no fans in the stands in war. That is purely about competition. So the very language that we use seems to either treat customers as direct competitors themselves or as poker chips, you know, the winnings that are gained, the currency that is used in fighting between two competitors. That doesn't seem very customer-focused, does it? There's a different way of looking at it. Maybe some of you know the old line from George Burns, the most important thing in life is sincerity. What's the punchline? If you can fake that, you got it made. And of course, George Burns' joke is funny because sincerity, of course, by definition, is the one thing you can't fake. Trust is much the same. People are human beings that are very complicated, complex. We may not know in our minds exactly what's happening, but we know in our hearts. And when somebody has bad intentions towards us, we know it. We recognize it. We can sniff it out. My guess is most of you in the room who are baby boomers like myself have figured out as you get older, you can trust your gut more than you can trust your head, or at least the proportion has been shifting over the years as we get older. Trust, again, is a bit of a paradox in the following kinds of ways. It turns out that the highest profit comes when you stop trying to see customers all the time only as sources of profit. There's a level below which it begins to flip on you. Sales happen most when you stop trying to, quote, sell in the conventional way that selling is defined by most of the outside world. Your influence is highest when you stop trying to convince people and simply engage in dialogues with them about what's the right thing to do. Relationships nurture transactions. If we can focus on relationships, transactions grow naturally. But if we focus all our attention on the transactions alone, it can kill off the relationships. Now, this paradox talk is not common in business. If you look, again, at Wall Street Journal, Business Week, the executive education programs, they don't talk paradoxes. But in normal everyday life, we use them all the time. How many skiers here? All right, the few of you, let's pick, boy, not very many skiers, interesting. Picture you're skiing somewhere in the east, and it's a little icy, and maybe you shouldn't have been on that black diamond, but here you are. You get to a little bit of steep slope, and your skis start to go out from under you. What is the very first reptilian brain, lowest level instinct to do? It's probably to lean back, which of course is exactly the wrong thing to do. Paradoxically, you need to lean into the snow, let your edges cut, let gravity be your friend. Any ex-baseball players here? You're playing shortstop, all right? We'll have to imagine this one. Playing shortstop, ball is hit hard to you, hard grounder or hard line drive, going to bounce 3 feet in front of you. Your first instinct is to back up. Wrong. We're taught charge the ball, play the ball, don't let the ball play you. If you're, God forbid, ever caught in a riptide, the tide is against you, your first instinct is to fight it, and that's fatal. You need to actually go with the flow. We're accustomed to talking about paradoxes in normal, everyday human life, but the language of business tends not to support it. I'm saying this because we all live in the world of business. You're not isolated from it. And despite the wonderful things that you folks have accomplished, you are very much influenced by the things you hear from the outside world. So let's be clear about them. Some of the old think in business has to do with focusing on vertical management. Ford Motor Company in the 30s actually owned rubber plantations in Brazil so that they could make tires and be assured of supply. Much of the business thinking in the past several decades has been around how do you manage a business. The phrase has always been sustainable, competitive, corporate advantage. Corporations are the central topic of discussion. Sustainable, competitive advantage is the theme. And finally, we have the general business world has tended to view customers as means to the end of sellers. That's the old think. Let me suggest a new world that you're moving into. It's going to look like this. Horizontal management. The phrases are outsourcing, joint ventures, integration, cooperation, collaboration, coordination. These are all the kinds of issues that, if you listen again to what was said earlier this morning, these are your key issues. How do you transact with partners? How do you structure these joint venture deals? How do you get better and better at an already terrific job of selling with customers? And as your scale goes up, these transactional relationships can flood you, can drown you. Trust happens to be the antidote to complexity in transactions. Horizontal connections is the name of the future business world. The atomic unit of business, if you will, becomes the individual. It's no longer the corporation. As you see people move all around and deal more and more with others, with outsourcers, with JVs, you have to get along with other individual human beings. The individual particular human ability to get along with each other ends up being strategically significant in a way that it never was when we were focused on competitive advantage. And finally, we need to start seeing customers as ends, not as means to our ends. Here's the ultimate paradox. If you really do a fabulous job of serving customers well, if your customers trust you, you will make a lot of money. But if you set out to make a lot of money by being trusted, it will blow up in your face. Because we all know the difference. We all know whether you're in it for yourself or for others. So the ultimate paradox is, if you'd like to be profitable, give up trying to be profitable. Go serve customers, period, end of sentence, all she wrote. Now, let's talk about the language of trust. How do you do this? How do people actually get good at trust creation? And I'll talk in a minute about how organizations do it as well. I have my own little arrow for how trust is created in conversations. Very simply, I won't go into detail here. Engage, listen, frame, envision, commit. It's a sequence of holding conversations. Of those 5 steps, the second one, listening, is vastly more important than the others. The most common trust process violations that we run into are one-dimensional listening, which is what, let's face it, a lot of us, when we're listening, when we're doing what we call listening, what we're really doing is waiting for the other person to shut up and finish talking so we can start looking smart again. That's what we call listening. That's what I call one-dimensional listening. The other most frequent breakdown of trust is jumping too quickly to conclusions and telling people, here's the answer, here's what you need. Trust creation has to work through a kind of a human process. Simple example, let's say I go to the doctor and I say, doctor, pain in my left arm. And I've been observing the symptoms for 2 weeks now so I can communicate to you. Here's what I found out. Number 1, it happens after I've eaten fried chicken. Number 2, it happens only on the 3rd floor of my building. What should I do? And the doctor says, yeah, no big deal. Take 2 ibuprofen and I'll see you next month. How do I feel? I feel dismissed, don't I? I feel unheard, unrecognized. Do I buy the ibuprofen? Maybe, maybe not. Even though presumably a doctor knows exactly what he or she is telling me, I might not actually buy the recommendation. Now, by contrast, I go into the doctor, I say, doctor, left arm hurts, fried chicken, 3rd floor. What do you think? And the doctor says, wait a minute, back up. Fried chicken? Have you tried it with French fries and fried fish? And I say, well, gee, fried fish? No, it doesn't. That's interesting. And French fries? Yes, it does. Doctor said, I thought so. Now, let me make another guess for you. It doesn't hurt on the 10th floor, but maybe it does on the 4th. Is that right? And I think, you're right, no pain on the 10th floor. How did he know that? And the doctor says, well, it's very simple, actually. The atmospheric conditions around here, interacting with the type of oil that's used for certain fast food cooking, has a strange reaction on certain people. Doesn't matter, no big deal. Take 2 ibuprofen, I'll see you next month. Now, how do I feel? I feel great. I've been heard, I've been listened to. An expert has ruled on my condition. Do I buy the ibuprofen? Absolutely. What's the difference? Not much at all. No content difference whatsoever. But I've been heard. So it's all the difference in the world. Trust can break down lots of different ways, but to cut to the chase, the single best way to get it back is to refocus the process on the notion of listening. So let me talk just a second about listening in ways that we haven't talked about before. There's a gentleman who works for Johnson & Johnson named Mike Lindemann. Mike used to run the training sessions for the volunteer suicide hotline in Lower Manhattan. So he had to train people who were volunteering to do good work. Now, the average volunteer for a suicide hotline is a very motivated person. They're probably high energy. They want to give back to society. They're problem solvers. The average suicide telephone call lasts 20 minutes. If you do not listen for the first 10 minutes, you lose your clients, for real. So here you have these volunteers coming in who are wired to solve problems. The average suicide call, some guy phones up and says, I'm on the Brooklyn Bridge, I'm going to kiss it all goodbye. My girlfriend has left me. My life is over. And the first instinct of these volunteers is, hey, stop. There's plenty of other girls out there, lots of fish in the sea. Don't worry about it. Talk you down. We can make this happen. What has to happen, these people have to be taught that human beings must first be listened to. That's a dramatic example, but a powerful one. It works on lower levels as well. Here's a radical suggestion for how to do listening in the right way. It's a two-part suggestion. Number one, listen by paying attention. A lot of the advice that's out there is, body language mirroring is one. I read one book that said, make sure you look at the person in the left eye for 8 seconds and then move for 2 seconds to the right eye and then look away for 3. Well, there are lots of different techniques, but you know what? None of them beat absolutely paying attention, complete focus on the other person in front of you. And of course, what gets in the way of that utter attention is we think we have to be thinking to come up with the answer to what they're saying. What if you were to give up on that thinking? What if you were to take all the brain power, all the bandwidth that you have, and focus it utterly, completely on that other human being? The only way to do that is to give up on thinking what you're going to say next, and the way to do that is to have the courage to be willing to think out loud when you're done listening. What do I mean by thinking out loud? I mean literally, gee, let me make sure I get what you're telling me here. That would mean that the foot bone's connected to the ankle bone. Is that right? The ankle bone or the leg bone? No, the leg bone comes later. I see. Literally, thinking out loud. Because if you are willing to think out loud with another person, you're demonstrating intimacy, you're demonstrating a sense of collaboration, nothing hidden up my sleeves, a willingness to work with the other person. It's hugely connecting. It creates trust. Start out by trying this on your kids. It's hard. It's hard to do. But you can work your way up to the more important relationships. It is powerful. Testimonial. Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist, author of the recent best-selling The World is Flat, very good book. In a commencement address last year, Friedman very interestingly spoke, people often ask how I, an American Jew, have been able to operate in the Arab Muslim world for 20 years. My answer is always the same. The secret is to be a good listener. It has never failed me. You can get away with really disagreeing with people as long as you show them the respect of really listening to what they have to say and taking it into account when and if it makes sense. The most important part of listening is that it is a sign of respect. It is not just what you hear by listening that is important. It is what you say by listening that is important. Never underestimate how much people just want to feel that they have been heard. Once you give them that chance, they will then hear you. And he's not just talking about sales here. He's talking about dialogues, interactions, persuasion, and in fact, the genesis of trust. How about at the organization level? What can you do about trust? There are 4 values that in an organization, if you consistently apply these values to all kinds of issues, you end up having a trust-enabled organization. They're fairly simple. Simple to say, hard to do. Genuine, consistent focus on the other person, the customer, or just the other person, for their ends, not for our own. Secondly, the adoption of a medium to long-term perspective. Instead of evaluating things in a short-term transactional perspective, look at them from a relational time frame. Third, an approach of mutuality and collaboration, a willingness to work together on all things as opposed to having to work solo. And finally, transparency. In all cases where legally possible, try and be utterly open about where you're coming from, what your thoughts are, what your feelings are, that there need be nothing hidden. Those are the 4 principles, and it was very interesting listening to Mr. Marriott today. I know enough about the entire Marriott organization, and obviously you're part of it as well, to know that you have a much better shot than some of your competitors at working in this new world because you're a culture that understands values. If you think about a more complicated world in the future that has to do with horizontal connections, that has to succeed by getting along with other people, how do you do that? You can't do it with incentives. Walk into the most current thinking about how do you get people to do things, and what do you hear from the business world? Incent them. Line up the rewards and incentives. Well, how do you, if you think that through, How do you say to somebody, okay, if you succeed in putting other people's interests ahead of you, I'll pay you a whole bunch of money? Do you get what's wrong with that? Oh, I see. Right, I'll be selfless so that I can get a lot of money. It doesn't work. You actually have to inculcate a culture that empowers values, a values-driven kind of an organization. And I think you folks have a better shot at that than many organizations out there. So to sum up again, trust in the future customer, the language of trust is not the language of business today. Some of the things that you hear out there in the broader world are not consistent with trustworthiness and trust creation, but it is the language of the successful business of the future. And as I said, I do think you have a better shot at it than average. It goes back to respect for culture and trust values at an institutional level. Let me give you some 10 quick hit steps that you can think about in raising trust on your own. Number 10, have higher bandwidth conversations when they're appropriate. Don't use email when you should be using voicemail. Don't use voicemail when you should be having a face-to-face conversation. And if you find yourself telephoning somebody at 12:45 p.m. because you know they're going to be out and you can leave a voicemail, check your motives. You're probably trying to avoid something. Look for higher bandwidth interactions. Believe the values, live the values. I don't know a better way. It's simply an admonition. The values stuff works. I used to think it was kind of flaky. It works. Getting people aligned along a series of common beliefs about what is right ways to behave with other human beings works. It works not just for soft, fuzzy, warm feelings. It also works hardcore on the bottom line in the new world that we're moving into. Return calls unbelievably fast. This is the easiest one on the list. You don't have to have the answer unbelievably fast. You just have to return the call. And the call may be, got your message. You know, I may not get to it until next Thursday, but I want you to know I got the message. I'm on the case. I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm thinking about it in the shower in the morning and on the drive home at night. You can take it off your worry list. I'm on the case. Talk to you soon. Easy to do. By the way, it helps you organize your own life as well. And very helpful for customers. How many of you right now have 2 people who haven't returned your phone call in the last 2 days, and it's starting to annoy you, and you're starting to wonder what's wrong with them? Was it something I said? How many? Got to believe a few more than that. Anyway, don't be the instrument of that with your interactions. When someone is angry at you, when somebody is yelling, screaming, mad at you, in your face, blaming you for something, what you have to remember is what you have here is not someone who's angry at you, but simply an angry person standing in close physical proximity to where you happen to be. And there is a difference. It's the biggest difference in the world. If you can see anger as a state of emotional being that they are in, then it doesn't have to be about you. And then rather than reacting defensively or attacking, you can then be in a position to actually react for them and say, wow, I've never seen you this upset. Clearly this is a big issue for you. I need to understand what's going on here. Please talk to me. And you can actually flip something around, as long as you can see it's not about you. That's the hardest one up here, but one of the most powerful. The phrase, let me be a channel. When you find yourself going into a stressful situation, it may be a sale, it may be a negotiation, it may be trying to get something from someone, it may be an unpleasant situation. If you're a religious person, then think of this as a prayer. If you think of yourself as a spiritual person, then consider this a mantra. If you consider yourself a stone-cold atheist, then call it a pre-flight checklist. It sort of doesn't matter. The idea is before you go into that confrontational place, stop for a moment, close your eyes, and say, you know what? I know a lot of great things that I can bring to this person, this situation. I can help this situation. Let me walk in, do the best that I can, and detach from the results. Check my ego at the door. Just do the next right thing and let it go. Assume you got the job and start working the issue. This is selling by doing, not selling by telling. Don't focus on getting the deal, closing the transaction, convincing that person. Engage in a dialogue. Figure out what the right thing is to do. Stop protesting your qualifications and why you're right on principle. Get into the issue. Start working it. It ends up being far more effective. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken anyway. There's a business case to be made for authenticity. And it goes something like this. With the possible exception of your 2-year-old child, everybody else already knows that you're not God. And your 2-year-old child, sadly, will figure that out fairly soon as well. In the 12-step programs originated by Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a great saying, there is a God, and you're not it. Right sizing. You're not as important as you think you are. You're not as unimportant as you think you are. You're not as smart as you think you are. You're not as dumb as you think you are. You have every right to be exactly where you are. You are who you are. Stop pretending. Let people know who you are. Again, when my boss interrupted that conversation in my sandpaper story and said, don't know anything about sandpaper, immediately, that's the paradox. Because he was willing to say what the limits of his knowledge were, he became instantly far more credible than if he had gone on and on and on about what he did know about sandpaper. Nobody thinks you're God. Let them know exactly which version of human imperfection you happen to be. They'll be delighted then to work with you. Make listening a gift of your attention, not a skill that you execute or do to people. Again, this notion of paying attention is at the heart of listening. Probably many of you have known people who have been able to do this, to engage in conversation with you and make you feel like you're the only person in the room. And if you think about it, my bet is that the people who did that happen to be really successful, really busy, really high-powered, and have a ton of things on their plate. And yet, these are the very people often who are capable of focusing on you. It's because they become willing to do the thing in front of them, to pay attention, because it pays off in the long run. Multitasking is a myth. We can all sniff it. When your 8-year-old child is talking to you on the phone, you know when they're instant messaging, right? Well, you know what? Everybody else can tell, too. As we get adult, we don't get that much better at hiding it. And the corollary, of course, of make listening a gift of your attention is have the courage to think out loud. And I do say courage, because it takes courage to sort of go out there and say, gee, I could be wrong. I could say something stupid. Well, yeah, you could. But on the whole, on the average, in the long run, you won't. And even when you do, you will simply be revealing the fact that you're open and willing to show that you're not hiding anything. My number one recommendation is to cultivate an attitude of curiosity. You can actually cultivate an attitude. You can get in the habit of continually asking yourself questions, asking your coworkers, your partners, your customers questions. The more you ask questions, the more you find out, the more you're able to offer good advice, the more the other person feels heard, and all the while, as you become curious, your level of self-orientation goes down towards zero. And self-orientation, again, is the single most powerful factor affecting trust. If I had to sum all this up in a short version, I haven't got it down quite to the t-shirt version, but we'll try this. People really strongly, deeply prefer to buy the things that they need anyway from people that they trust. And as a quick proxy for trust, people tend to focus on those who care about them. And as a proxy for caring, we look at paying attention. Do they pay attention to me? If they do, gee, it feels like maybe they actually care. If it feels like they actually care, we say we trust them. To be trusted, be trustworthy. There's no shortcut around it. How do you get people to trust you? Be worthy of their trust. Dare to care. These slides I will put up online. Some of the heavy graphics I've left out, but the core messages I'll have online available to you at trustedadvisor.com/MVCI. That last part is case sensitive. It has to be lowercase. trustedadvisor.com/MVCI. There are also a number of free articles available on there. By the way, it's in my enlightened self-interest to have you go there because it increases my click rate, and also maybe you'll buy one of my 2 books, which are located up here. But that's enough of the pitch. Just write down the website. And we have just about on the right time here, and I think I'm going to turn it back. And thank you very much for your time and attention and your invitation to have me here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It was great. Thank you.